Your First 100 Million, second edition, chapter 5, Building Perception to Become Reality. Super success begins with your masterful illusion that it already exists. Never underestimate the power of illusion. Not only does it help create what you'd like for the people to believe, it helps you create what they must believe for you to achieve your goals. We live in a brutal world made more tolerable by the illusion of reality. For centuries, as an example, the true nature of war was masked in the grand illusion of colorful parades, splendid uniforms, and flying flags. The warnings of those who returned from war, who quietly described its horror, were lost in the trumpet strains of marching tunes. Only late in this century, when TV news brought the carnage of battle home around dinner time, did the general public finally realize that all the glory and grandeur was illusion. Authors note, this reality, this stark reality that's been brought even more to the public in recent years with the recent war in the Middle East and almost countless tragedies. End of author's note. Illusion is one of the skills of leadership. In the epic movie Patton, the fiery general played by the late George C. Scott becomes frustrated at being unable to break through German lines to relieve the siege of Bastogne. Suddenly, he roars in anger at his staff, "We're going to attack all night. We're going to attack tomorrow morning. If we're not victorious, let no man come back alive." No one moves, no one speaks as Patton strides past them through the stunned silence. Then his aide approaches him and says gently, "General, sometimes they can't tell when you're acting and when you're not." Patton replies, "It isn't important for them to know. It's important for me to know." Perception is reality in any business. When I was a young hotshot real estate salesman in Southern California, I sold lots of Lake Havasu, an artificial lake on the Colorado River between California and Arizona. Lake Havasu later became the unlikely home of London Bridge. It was surrounded by miles of desolate desert and wasn't the fashionable resort region it is now. I'd take prospective buyers out there and we'd stand gazing across the lake. Aside from the expanse of water, it wasn't a very inviting place. So I didn't sell the place. I sold them their own perception of their dream. I'd say something like, "Look out there. You can see the sails of your boat as the breeze nudges you across the lake. Look over there. You can almost see the fishing dock and that luxurious clubhouse where you meet your friends for dinner." I sold a shitload of desert in those days. Illusion is the camouflage behind which we pursue our dreams and goals for super success. It is the stage we set, the costume we don, the face we present to achieve our objectives. Within the bounds of law and ethics, illusion is your weapon to build the most advantageous perception you can in the minds of the stockholders, stockbrokers, attorneys, competitors, and the public at large, all for the accelerating advancement of your company. "But Dan," you ask, "are you suggesting I create illusions about my company?" You're damn right. You've got to do what it takes. If you run a business, your job as head of your company goes well beyond making sure it produces a top quality product or service and sells it at a fair price. You've got to spend days and nights continuously pumping credibility into the facade that your company represents to the business community, to make it appear on a business skyline not simply as large as it is, but a hell of a lot bigger and infinitely nicer to do business with. The importance of perception was not lost on the Chinese government during the 2008 Olympiad in Beijing. Thousands of factories around the city burned cheap, dirty, and anthracite coal with no thought of incredible pollution it creates. Diesel trucks and buses and an explosion in private car ownership have helped turn Beijing's sky into a perpetual brown haze. The foreign community laughingly calls it morning fog or sulfuric sunset. Sports trainers and sponsors around the world hinted they might pull out of the Olympics rather than subject athletes to breathing the brown. The government said not to worry. Meanwhile, Many of the manicured avenues leading into Beijing from the new billion-dollar airport pass by the crumbling old villages, waste dumps, and slums that are part of any Asian capital. The government said not to worry. At the same time, millions of Chinese people were spitting, blowing their nose, and taking a piss on the roadsides and against building walls. Traditional Chinese customs all. Not a problem, said the government. So, in preparation to host the world, the Chinese government cleaned up their perception. Some of the largest factories were literally pulled up and relocated hundreds of miles from Beijing so they could harmlessly pollute the countryside. Other factories across Beijing were simply shut down for 10 days by government decree. Owners of private vehicles with old and even ending license plates were ordered to stay home every other day, to carpool or enter the city at risk of heavy fine. The skies cleared. To make Beijing more beautiful, the government demolished countless homes and neighborhoods near the major traffic arteries and rail lines. Construction sites, industrial areas, waste dumps, and apartment towers all over Beijing were concealed from the view by enormous temporary billboards promoting the One World, One Dream theme of the Olympics. Beijing was suddenly neither a city under construction nor a city in decline, but just about perfect in every way. In China, if the government tells you not to spit and where to shit, you listen. In advance of the Olympics, a public relations blitz warned Beijingers not to spit, not to cheat foreign friends, or offend them in any way. Basic English phrases were drilled into the taxi drivers, bellhops, and anyone else likely to come in contact with foreigners. Beijing, normally about as warm and fuzzy as New York City, sparkled clean, green, and friendly for 10 days. And the perception of Beijing became the reality that millions took home with them. Author's note, having visited the Olympics, not the Olympics, but Beijing shortly before the Beijing Olympics, it was unbelievably clean and pristine, just as I described when this was written. It has stayed fairly clean, but the beige or brown haze, but not as bad. End of author's note. Cities with infinite human and capital resources are one thing, but what about the perception you are creating personally as an individual and as a representative of the company? For starters, you only have one opportunity to establish a powerful initial perception of yourself. The cliche is correct. You don't get a second chance to make a first impression. Suppose you had a young person call you for an interview appointment. 15 minutes after the appointed time, he shows up in jeans and a bad boy t-shirt. His hair should be on his sister's head. He's got an earring, a menagerie of tattoos, and an attitude. Now, this kid could have just graduated from Harvard Business School, but you couldn't care less. You've judged him by his appearance, and he's out of there. You don't give a damn, and that is what would have been politically correct for you seriously to consider this bum, just to show what an open-minded guy you are. As far as I'm concerned, political correctness is an idea made up by psychobabblers to make habitual winners and full-time victims feel better. But what the hell do I know? I'm just a money-enabled white man. Author's note, having just publicly endorsed Donald Trump for president in the last couple of weeks, and having been beating my chest on my various podcasts, saying that political correctness is a manifestation of the lack of self-esteem, this is more set in concrete and has been validated more in recent years than ever before. End of author's note. The point is, the kid created the instant perception of a goofy, worthless doofus, which was real enough for you to believe in. When I go to a business meeting, and especially an initial meeting with people I've never met, I dress for the occasion. That means a Savile Row tailored suit, maybe with a waistcoat vest, hand-tailored dress shirt, bow tie, antique gold pocket watch, and free flowing breast pocket handkerchief. The message to those is, I don't look like them because I'm not like them. And when I walk into the room, I want those morons to know at a glance, it is a microsecond, that their lives and destinies are going to change forever because I walked in. Author's note, having just turned 70, I still wear what is called the uniform, and it still works not just for me, but for all my countless mentees and devotees all over the world. End of author's note. But you know what? I dressed like that before I was super successful. I've used attire to my advantage ever since I returned from Europe after working with NATO. It was there, even as a young officer, that I first saw how the European well-to-do dressed and how they created, by their actions, even facial expressions, an immediate perception of calm, studied self-assurance, and aura of arrogance, regardless of how shallow and superficial they might prove to be. Author's note: when I had the privilege of meeting and working with and being mentored by Costa Gratsos, the CEO of Onassis Shipping Lines, the right-hand man for 60-plus years of Aristotle Onassis, he told me, Mr. Pena, always remember, dress British and think Yiddish. End of author's note. Candace Knoll remembers, I've known Candace since 1983 when I was traveling back and forth between London and Houston. She's a classy lady. Her company, Executive Lodging, was and is an upscale concierge service specializing in accommodating the needs and preferences of top executives. She's seen and dealt with plenty of high-priced business people. What I remember most about Dan was the way he entered a room: custom three-piece suit, breast pocket handkerchief tucked just right, gold cufflinks, every detail manicured to perfection. How could a banker not be impressed, even intimidated by the famous Pena presence? You bet they were intimidated. In the years that followed, when I'd go see a potential lender, especially one of those pasty-faced loan officers that makes $35,000 a year, I'd approach his desk like the battleship Missouri about to dock. The suit, the attitude, the eat your lunch, eye contact. The poor son of a bitch would be asking himself, why does he need to talk about a loan? We should probably be borrowing from him. Nowadays, with a multi-million-dollar credit line, I send one of my associates over to handle financing transactions. That suits the banks just fine. They still cringe when they see me walk in. Author's note: as my lovely wife Sally would attest to, a chartered accountant in her own right in the UK, most loan officers or any of the people that we have financial relationships with just as soon not attend a second meeting. End of author's note. Along these lines, a great book I recommend you read is Winning Through Intimidation, written by Robert Ringer. It advocates assuming an assertive posture of strength in doing business in order to hold the initiative. Although it was written in the 70s, its strategies are still applicable in the 21st century. Author's note: I mean the original Winning Through Intimidation, not its derivative copies, but the original. End of author's note. George and Deanne Verdier, my friends who are experiencing a quantum leap in their business, travel much of the year arranging and producing upscale craft expositions in major cities. Dean points out they always wear executive attire to take a commercial flight, regardless of the destination or schedule. We've avoided the temptation to fly in jeans and sweatshirts for several reasons, says Deanne. First, we never know who among our associates or clients we will run into or that the potential business contact will meet on the plane, especially while flying first class. But we also discovered that the airline people actually treat us better when we're better dressed. They're friendlier, the service is better, and they are more likely to give us a nod if a first class upgrade becomes available. But it's more than dress. I mentioned attitude and eye contact earlier because they are among the most important nonverbal signals you can send to create a perception of power. Research has long confirmed that powerful people use eye movements to dominate and control conversation. When they speak, for example, high performers look at others squarely in the eye, but then look away when they listen. An executive who continuously looks another executive in the eye while the person is talking is perceived to be too eager to please and easily manipulated. Personality development books tell you to smile when you go into a new interpersonal situation. Make people feel at ease. If I'm walking into a corporate office of an executive with whom I'm negotiating, or into a cubicle of some doofus loan officer to talk about money, I don't want the moron feeling at ease. My intent is to create an instant perception of myself as a super successful individual who doesn't need to impress anybody with flattery. I'm not there to be this guy's friend or especially his whipping boy. I'm going to intimidate him in his own ballpark so that he has to struggle just to stay on the defensive. He has to earn a smile and a pat on the head from Dan Pena by saying what Dan Pena wants to hear. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? By the way, part of my persona as super successful multimillionaire is my refusal to carry business cards. Why not? Do you think Ted Turner carries a business card or Donald Trump? The super successful do not distribute business cards. Instead, they say, have your secretary call my office. They know where to reach me. Author's note: many years ago, while in a business relationship with Bunker Hunt, I was at a famous press conference where he commented that he was not trying to corner the silver market. And when asked after the press conference for a business card by one of the leading journalists, he said, I don't carry business cards. You know how to get a hold of me. End of author's note. Yes, first impressions are important, but even more important than the first snapshot of you walking in is the consistency of your impression. After all, the multidimensional image you mold in the mind of the potential investor, lender, or equity partner is only a compilation of several smaller meetings and contacts. Each contact adds another facet to who you are, another quality of your character, personality, and business style. It's important that as you build this dimensionability, you don't create confusing, contradictory images. Every face you show must agree with the overall image you wish to create. In the bestseller, 110% Solution, Mark McCormack made an astute observation about putting first impressions into perspective. Think about the long-term relationship in your life, in or out of workplace. The chances are they don't blossom because someone overwhelmed you the first time you met, but rather because of the continued influencing you on a second, third, and fourth occasion. Consistency of perception is also vital with your own associates and employees. They need to know action A will generally provoke response A. Employees perform more effectively when they are not constantly beating their brains out trying to guess what your reaction will be, what mood you're in, or what executive mask you're wearing today. That's not to say you should not cultivate the image of unemotional, unflappable boss. A little well-placed and justified rage now and then does wonders, but save your table-pounding theatrics for special occasions so they'll make a more profound impression. Mark McCormack recommends some occasional unexpected behavior. If your people are expecting you to yell, speak softly but forcefully. If your counterpart across the negotiating table is expecting a certain tactic, change fields and run another pattern. While consistency is a virtue, certain predictability is boring as hell. As far as corporate perceptions, some moderately successful corporations maintain an image much like the punk kid I described above. At one Florida marketing firm, the boss comes in the office in a sweatsuit. The employees wear jeans or shorts, and the atmosphere is more like a factory floor than an executive office. All day long, the air is filled with chaos, sophomoric screaming and cursing, to the extent their business neighbors have come over to complain. What kind of perception does this create for walk-in clients expecting professional behavior, or even suppliers who talk about the company to the competitors? The owner, a perennial wise guy, will never change, and his company will never become super successful. Instead of pulling a company down, perception should boost the company up to the plane to which its leadership aspires. I related in a second chapter how I tied the Great Western dinghy to the seaworthy reputation of Marion Refining. It never occurred to the gray metal desk government weenies to ask about the size of the worth of Great Western vis-a-vis Marion, that I might be just one man working out of his kid's bedroom. That simple ploy of associating my company with larger companies in what appeared to be an equal joint venture became the key rung of the ladder of our success. They must be legit. So the reasoning went, look who they're partnering with. Here's another perception that paid off handsomely for all of us. From day one, Great Western Resources paid a dividend. We had no earnings to speak of, but we paid the dividend to shareholders however we could. That's because I wanted us to be viewed from the beginning as an income stock. That way, mutual fund portfolio managers would consider including Great Western in their more conservative income-producing funds. When investors looked in the newspaper of Great Western Resources dividends, it didn't say dividends paid since 1975, 2 months ago. It just said dividends. We had an instant credibility in the market. We got bought up by income funds like crazy. The stock price went through the roof, almost doubling in just 4 months. Nobody ever called up, not once, and asked, how long have you been paying dividends? Perception was reality. Later, after I was gone but still held substantial stock, the company decided to stop paying dividends. I don't know why, as stockholders and new company management were getting dividends too. It turned out that they cut their own throats. When the dividends ended, the stock plunged into the toilet and they lost a lot of money. One of my disciples, we'll call him Wilbur, was an entrepreneurial pilot. He worked out of his house near until his business took off, or out of his hotel rooms, whatever he happened to be laying over between flights. But he was thinking well beyond his career in the cockpit, continuously interviewing major accounting firms, investment banks, and others as he built his dream team. And all the while, he was creating a clear perception of an established and knowledgeable businessman. If you had called Wilbur in those days, he didn't pick up his phone and say hello. His calls were routed through an answering service that acted as his corporate switchboard. Good morning, the Diversified Company. The caller, once identified, would be put through as if Wilbur was back in the executive offices. He even used remote call forwarding so that if he happened to be laying over in some Holiday Inn, the perception was maintained. Hey, he would tell me, it cost me about $100 a month, and for all they know, the Diversified Company is a large corporation in the Executive Tower in downtown Philadelphia. The Verdiers work to maintain perception to their craft shows as prestigious events, admitting only the most qualified exhibitors and sponsors. In a few of our markets, our shows have to be staged in fairground arenas. That means we have to work even harder to project that upscale image and to put as much distance as possible between our expositions and the other flea markets that come along. As our shows have grown in popularity and reputation, we've had to be more and more particular about who we accept to sponsor them in each city. As part of maintaining our quality perception, we limit our sponsors to such respectable entities as newspapers, radio stations, which appeal to our demographics, no rap, no rock, banks, and soft drink companies. George Verdier points out these perceptions will only endure for so long in order to produce a successful and profitable event. He and Deanne must build a perception of their show's quality in given markets long before the show ever opens. Once we open, image gives way to quality of our performance, and we replace our carefully constructed perception with reality and reputations. If you can't follow through, all the perception in the world is a house of cards. Early on in the development of Great Western Resources, it grew increasingly clear that if any company and I were going anywhere, we both had to look as if we were already there. I knew that our business partners, investors, and financial community in general had to see me now as I planned to become in the future, or we wouldn't even have a future. I needed a quick transfusion of perception, one so dramatic that it was virtually inarguable. So, as I mentioned earlier, that's when I decided to buy the castle I could hardly afford. It was an expensive project and a huge task, emotionally and logistically, to relocate from a major U.S. city to rural Scotland. But it worked. Acquiring a Scottish castle quickly becomes grist for conversation and grudging awe, even in the jaded corridors and conference rooms of Manhattan. As soon as Wall Street realized I didn't need their help, I got it. It was a case of using reality, the purchase, to create a perception that drives a greater reality. Speaking of illusion, I decided that in order to accelerate our castle shopping, I had to be perceived as a serious potential buyer. After all, there are those who play, let's pretend, with high-end properties for sale. They read the classifieds of European publications, then drive out to view this or that castle or chateau just to gain entry and see what it's like. Real estate people can smell an imposter instantly and reserve them for a special level of disdain. So, for the purpose of putting in separation between myself and the proletariat, and to create the perception I could even afford a castle, I would hire a chauffeur-driven luxury automobile before a viewing appointment. You can imagine how the appearance of such a spectacle gliding onto your grounds would affect the attitude of a real estate representative. I was warmly welcomed and afforded every courtesy, of course, but more importantly, I forced the issue of serious negotiations. In this case, I used perception to cut to the chase of purchasing my dream castle. Granted, Guthrie Castle is an extreme example, but what about the perception of success you need to cultivate in order to even be more successful? When you buy a new luxury car or even an exclusive club as a way to accelerate business success, aren't you acting as if the perception you desire is already reality? Of course you are. Author's note: since the purchase of the castle, closing of the castle in August 1984, we have had, depending on what you would describe as a renovation, between 5 and 7 renovations of the castle. The old Garrel that was originally built initiated the building of in 1468, and virtually everything is state of the art, with 2 gyms and a game room, and it is quite a spectacular site. End of author's note. Sure, you could drive a Chevy until super successful and then buy a Rolls, but not only would you continue to think in a Chevy mentality about your success, you'd be encouraging others to do the same. I notice he drives an old Chevy. Looks like he really needs the money. We'd be safer not to approve his loan. Exceptions to this rule are Bill Gates, who drives a bright blue '99 Porsche 911, and Warren Buffett and Steve Ballmer, CEO of Microsoft, both whom drive Lincoln Town Cars. Author's note: I'm not sure what Bill Gates drives, but Mr. Buffett still drives Lincoln Town Cars. End of author's note. Another exception: Rick Scott, former CEO of a major healthcare corporation, drove a Buick with no radio while he was building his empire. But his social events were elaborate affairs attended by some of the wealthiest men and women in America. Author's note: Rick Scott is currently in his second term of sitting governor of the state of Florida, and also just recently endorsed Donald Trump. Rick was my transaction lawyer, and in the middle 80s asked me, how can I do what you do or make the money you make, Dan? And words to the effect, I said to Rick, you have to leave me. He said, where should I go? I said, healthcare and telco, which transformed into the internet. And I still tell people 30 plus years later that healthcare and telco stroke internet are the places to go. And Rick Scott was an initial Cule devotee. End of author's note. The lesson here is to position yourself where you believe people will perceive you as being successful. The Hollywood crowd, of course, has been doing this for generations. This strategy has benefits beyond the doofus lending officer. When you're perceived to be a success, business people want to be associated with you. You become sought out by others with a potential deal. You spend less time fishing for opportunities because the fish begin jumping into your net and even your boat. My own perception as a deal maker, of course, became reality. As a result, over the years, I've been continuously deluged with plans, schemes, and even a few good ideas presented by individuals and corporations looking for a champion for their venture. They know I'm always looking, and I'm a real serious player. Author's note: I have said for many years, decades now, that my door being always open and me always turning over rocks and always going to meetings and meeting people at airports, etc. in my travels is kissing frogs. I still kiss frogs even at this stage of my life at 70. I still see people in cities as I travel around because I'm forever looking for the possibility of that great transaction. End of author's note. Using perceptions to create realities is not limited to image building for up-and-coming companies or individuals. It permeates every phase of business corporations. A successful company needs to pump up its image at strategic times throughout its corporate life. When you're preparing for an initial public offering, IPO, you want brokers and purchasers alike to perceive an enormously shrewd, dynamic, and aggressive company poised for skyrocketing success. You want editorial columns in the Wall Street Journal and your top executives to be seen as the most exclusive circles, exuding acumen, confidence, and comfort about taking their company public. You want stockbrokers and potential buyers talking hungrily about you at lunch, licking their lips for your stock long before the day that you go public. Remember, the perception of the stock isn't based on any face value, but the demand that has been generated for the stock. If you do it right, the result on the day of the offering, as it was with us in London on that August 10th, will be that of selling shares at spiraling prices to eager investors quite willing to pay those prices. Author's note, I may have mentioned it, but on the day that we went public in August the 10th, 1984, my 39th birthday, was also the day that Mrs. Thatcher's, one of her major privatizations, that of Jaguar, was going public. And I was advised by virtually all concerned that we shouldn't go public on the same day because all the institutional money was going into the Jaguar flotation. And I persevered and sold many of the shares myself to the investment public, and the headlines read, the one that really roared, Great Western up 20%, and I believe Jaguar down 20%. End of author's note. Finally, well before the time comes to sell your company, you begin using a number of proven strategies to build perception of a successful, profitable corporation. We'll cover those strategies in a later chapter. We live in a world of perception. Virtually nothing is really as it seems, only as sleight of hand manipulators would have us believe. Don't forget that others with whom you deal or would deal are busy building perceptions for your consumption. They range from resumes filled with lies to financial statements with more juggling than Ringling Brothers. Politics is the continuous example of juggling act, of putting a spin on every political event so that even the poor sap that debated with his fly down comes off looking terrific. During campaign season, when politicians actually want to hear from voters, perceptions can make or break candidates. Author's note, during this month's coming to the election here in 2016, Donald Trump has stood the Republican Party and politics in general on its head with not believing in political correctness and showing perception is reality. End of author's note. For years, Hillary Clinton has been perceived by much of the public as cold, calculating, and ambitious. She has polarized Americans who either love or hate her. During the 2008 presidential election, she faced Senator Barack Obama in the Democratic primaries, a smooth, personable, and very likable African American. As a result, this dapper, affable black man with virtually no experience but strong in vague and lofty rhetoric was preferred by Democratic primary voters to a woman with several years of experience as a senator from New York, a Washington insider whose husband Bill was a former president. These two contrasting perceptions, not their stands on political issues, swayed primary voters to nominate Obama over perhaps the best American woman in the world. Author's note, Mrs. Clinton is now coming up against a similar situation with Senator Bernie Sanders, a independent, one-time communist, now socialist, and has lost many of the primaries, and it stands to a good chance of perhaps having to go to a contested bid in the Democratic convention herself. End of author's note. That's why wherever you're called on to believe a perception, it's absolutely vital for you to look beyond the illusion others would have you take as reality. In the ideal world, everyone would be forthright and honest in presenting themselves and their corporate entities, warts and all. But until that ideal comes along, perception will be the reality others accept about you. So it's up to you to craft that reality to your fullest advantage. Fortunately, you need not to do it alone. You can gather around you resources, some very skilled individuals in many disciplines. The dream team we discuss in the next chapter. Author's note, the QLA model methodologies, one of the cornerstones is the dream team, and it was almost 3 years ago as I read this, and it is today. End of author's note.